everybody. I hope you are having a great day. Welcome to Roundtable Conversations again. Today, we are interviewing John Gastil, who is a professor in political communications in Penn State University. I've had the pleasure of hearing him on a talk that was hosted by Bravers Angels, where he presented this interesting initiative that he's researching. It's called the Citizens Initiative Review. It's something that an organization called Healthy Democracy is promoting, and he's been doing a lot of research that ties into it. And I would like, without any further ado, to let him speak about it, present it. John Gastil, why don't you present to our audience who you are, what you do, and what you think about this initiative that you've been researching?
Hey, first, thanks for having me on the program. Your viewers and/or listeners, hopefully we'll have a good time. I can just tell you, before you started recording, we were just having great laughs. So again, it's a pleasure, a great way to spend the day. So what you were referring to just then is a 10-year research project that I've been doing with a bunch of colleagues, but principally with Katherine Knobloch. And she and I just published a book this year called Hope for Democracy: How Citizens Can Bring Reason Back into Politics. And the book is about a bigger argument about how we need more deliberation in the democratic process. But it's also a specific argument about the efficacy of a particular election reform. I'm fond of saying it's the best election reform you've never heard of. And we'll get into the details on that, but just to start us off with the simple idea, the Citizens Initiative Review was meant to solve the problem in direct democracy where voters really don't necessarily know and understand the details of the laws they're asked to vote on. And the legislature in Oregon agreed with that analysis and wound up passing into law a process whereby a small random sample of the state, just 20 to 24 people, meet for 4 or 5 days, hear from both sides of the issue, hear from a few outside experts, and then write a one-page analysis that goes into the official voter's guide for every voter in the state of Oregon. So it's one of those vote by mail states. We've been hearing a lot about vote by mail. In Oregon, you receive your ballot in the mail, and you receive a voting guide in the mail. And now that voting guide, every even numbered year, when a Citizens Initiative Review, or we'll just call them CIRs, when a CIR is held, you'll find that page in there on Measure 85 or whatever it is that has, in the words of your fellow citizens, what they think you really need to know in terms of their key findings about the issue and what they consider the strongest pro and con arguments. Such a simple idea. But to date, Oregon is the only state that has this established by law, but we may talk a little bit later about who else is trying it and considering passing legislation to make it a permanent part of their process.
Okay, so it sounds like Oregon has a tendency to ask its citizens a lot about new proposals for law. Like they put it out like a questionnaire to all of their citizens. We have this new law proposed. Do you think we should vote it in or not vote it into law? And I think that sounds like it's a big basis for it. And if you could elaborate a bit more about the process itself. So basically, if I am a citizen of Oregon, I will get in the mail what? An proposal for a new law, and there will be a summary of some sort prepared by the Citizens Initiative Review?
Well, think of it this way. A lot of people in the United States don't live in a state where laws are put on the ballot through the initiative process. And people are quick to say, well, this doesn't apply to where I live. But actually, almost all of us vote on questions besides candidates on our ballot. It may be a local bond measure. It may be a change to the city charter. Could be any number of things. And then many of us do live in places where we're voting directly on legislation, whether it's at the city, county, or state level. So in Oregon, the Citizens Initiative Review was really built for just one kind of direct democratic process, specifically when an initiative gathers signatures, and then by virtue of having enough valid signatures is going to be on your ballot, the same ballot that has, the presidential candidates at the top and other things all the way down. It will appear there, and if the Citizens Initiative Review Commission has the funding and views that issue as sufficiently important in terms of, say, its fiscal impact, its constitutional relevance, and so on, well, then they will commission Healthy Democracy to convene a Citizens Initiative Review, and that CIR will then write its analysis. That page goes in the voter's guide. So if you're a voter and you see Measure 85, you'll see the title of the ballot measure, then an official summary and fiscal impact written by the state of Oregon, And as you might guess, those tend to be pretty opaque. They don't really get to the heart of the matter, partly because public officials are nervous about looking partisan. But then you'll quickly get to this one-page analysis, again, written in language that voters think their fellow voters will be able to understand, that does directly address the things that they probably care about the most about that issue.
I see. And why does this help? Like, why would you want a summary of the law? How is this summary crafted, and what benefits are there to this process of crafting it?
Sure. I'll take just one quick example. The very first Citizens Initiative review was on a mandatory minimum sentencing law, saying that if you commit one of two categories of crime, one was about felony sexual assault and the other about drunk driving. If you meet these thresholds, the judge has to give a sentence of a certain length at a minimum. That's mandatory minimum sentencing law for you. Now, without knowing anything more about it, and it's fair to say most Oregon voters didn't really know much more about it other than the title of the measure, about a 12-word kind of description is what that really is. You might think, well, either you're tough on crime or you're not, right? If your values are relatively punitive and you believe incarceration is the answer, well, then vote for it, right? Well, that was a striking deliberation, because in the end, of the 24 citizens on that first CIR, 21 of them wound up opposing the law. And, how did they shift so far? I mean, they were politically very diverse. The reason they shifted so far was the devil was in the details. The law had some real problems in it as proposed. Just one example. When people say, oh gosh, felony sex crimes, that sounds terrible. And these are only for repeat offenders, right? Yeah, we got to lock them up. Well, it's not immediately obvious until you look at it more closely, as the CIR did, that includes a 17-year-old high school student sending 2 explicit pictures to a 15-year-old high school student. That's a 20-year sentence. That wasn't the intention of even the bill's sponsors. And in the course of this 5-day process, they had to confess that, yeah, okay, no, we didn't want that. Well, we're confident no one will enforce that. Or they later said, well, the legislature will surely fix that. The problem is the very logic that they used at the start of their argument on their first day they appeared before the CIR was, the reason we put these laws on the ballot is you cannot trust the legislature to do what's right. That's why we ask you, the people of Oregon, to decide, what's right and what isn't. To then obviously try to save yourself by saying, well, the legislature will get it right. Don't worry. It's just such a contradiction. It was just too much. And problem after problem mounted and mounted for this. Now, again, notice how different that reality is, that having to essentially sustain your argument for multiple days under questioning and scrutiny with your critics sitting right across from you, that's very different from having a very effective 30-second TV commercial, right? So it results in a very different kind of judgment on the part of citizens. And that was very effectively conveyed through the CIR statement. Now, as it happens, that was the very first CIR, and our surveys suggest that not even a majority of Oregonians ultimately knew that happened and found it in their voting guide. A lot of people don't use the voting guide. But over the years now, that was back in 2010, and there's several iterations of this have happened since. It looks like the CIR can probably bump the vote count maybe in the neighborhood of 5%. So if your initiative is sitting pretty and it looks like you're going to get a huge percentage of the vote, as was the case in this election, if the CIR writes a statement that's in effect very critical of your proposal, you're probably still safe. But if you're a professional campaign consultant and someone tells you there's a process that can move the vote 5%, you're going to say, holy smokes, I can't buy that for you. Tell me about this process. And that's the CIR. So that's, I think, a fascinating thing about it is that, yeah, it's limited in terms of how far it can move the electorate, but it can potentially move the electorate on an issue farther than almost any campaign can.
I'm still a bit unclear about the format of this process. It sounds a bit like, when you're speaking about it, what comes to mind is something like a jury. Could you describe the process, how it actually happens, so maybe our audience can relate to it more?
Sure. The analogy you're using is not a coincidence. So, Ned Crosby is a philanthropist and democratic theorist and reformer who conceived the citizens jury back in the 1970s and has run tons of experiments using that name. He created the Jefferson Center for New Democratic Processes in Minnesota that's run these all over the years. He was always interested in applying that directly to electoral issues. And long story short, a couple young activists who got master's degrees in public policy got excited about the idea of what became the CIR, got connected with Ned. They got connected with me. I had written about the idea in a book published in 2000 called By Popular Demand. And they just said, you know what, I think the legislature is going to go for this. And so they implemented it. So what does it look like? Well, again, because of that history, it does look a little bit like a jury in that you can picture the jury sort of sitting in the jury box, hearing witnesses, right? And then deliberating in the privacy of the deliberation room, and rendering a verdict. And until recently, the Citizens Initiative Review did always have their vote, the vote of those panelists on that one page. It doesn't anymore, and the other people who have tested it out don't do that. For various reasons we could get into. But in that sense, it is like a jury. Now, here's how it's not like a jury. Juries in the United States have only recently, and only in some jurisdictions, gotten the ability to ask questions during a trial. That's a jury reform meant to make the jury a little more active and engaged in the trial. And it's apparently working very well. They hand a question to the bailiff, who hands it to the judge, and the judge decides whether to read the question, and then expects an answer. Sometimes the neat thing about that is that jury sometimes asks a question that neither the defense nor the prosecution really want to have asked, right? But it could be very revealing, right? But it could, affect either potential side in a way they don't want. Well, the Citizens Initiative Review is all about asking questions, right? I mean, that's baked right into the process. You're asking directly questions to the people who are either proponents or opponents of the law, or who are brought in as neutral experts who are agreeable to both sides but don't really represent either side. The questions just keep coming. And you might have watched one of our presidential debates this year or in a past year and gotten so frustrated, right, when the question is asked and the candidate somehow uses up more than 2 minutes without even coming close to answering the question. Well, that just doesn't work at a CIR. Right? You can dodge the question and they'll generally be respectful of you until you finish, though the clock is running on your time and you're really, frankly, wasting it by not answering the question, because the next question will be, I'm sorry, that didn't answer my question. I'm going to ask that question again. Or sometimes another panelist will say, yeah, no, that was not an answer to her question. Do you need me to repeat it, or are you not going to answer it? Right? The panelists sometimes grow impatient. At that very first CIR, there was just an epic mistake by the proponents of that mandatory minimum sentencing law, which is they had complained repeatedly about how there was so little time. This wasn't a real court. This wasn't like a real jury. They couldn't possibly understand this law, which of course is going to be on the ballot for voters to understand without any study. But they said, look, the fact is we just don't have time to make our arguments to you. So what did they do? In their closing argument, was a good chunk of time consisted of showing them a video of horrific car wrecks involving drunk drivers, one presumes, because remember, it was about 2 different mandatory minimum sentencing. And then the chief proponent of the law telling this kind of rambling personal story, which also sounded kind of dubious. Right. It was just a terrible use of time. In fact, the movie, which had various, rock music and country music behind it, was so offensive to some of the panelists who felt their time was absolutely being wasted. There was no argument being made. There was no evidence being put up on the screen. It was just an emotional appeal. Some of them actually left the room. And when a couple of researchers asked, hey, I noticed you're outside the room, they basically said, look, I am so mad at them right now for wasting our time after berating us for not, giving them enough time. I just had to leave the room because I don't want to do anything disrespectful. I'll go back in as soon as I calm down. And they would go back in a minute or two after, just catching their breath because it was so ridiculous. Right now, I haven't seen a side pro and con do so badly since at a CIR. But the point is, you really have to have evidence behind your arguments, because just as a jury, it gets concerned when you start telling a story and it doesn't add up. so does the CIR. The difference is they'll immediately point out that you're not persuading anyone. They don't understand why you're reaching the conclusions you do. Why you said that you want us to say something in our statement, you haven't justified it. Why would we say that that's true, right? Or why would we say that's a concern? Give us some better evidence, right? Give us a better reason. And sometimes the CIR isn't so much, debating and weighing the facts. That's another way in which it differs from a jury. A jury is just supposed to decide on the facts, right? Well, the CIR has a bigger job than that. They have to do that. But to take another example, a CIR was held on the question of whether to authorize private casinos off of tribal land in the state of Oregon. Casinos are allowed, but only on Native American land in the state. And this would have allowed for private, for-profit casinos to exist elsewhere. What other kind of casino is there than for-profit? I guess there's Casino Night, which actually did come up in the deliberation, for nonprofits and so on. But one of the strongest arguments for the attorney who was opposing this, and he represents tribal casinos, and it was himself Native American, one of the strongest arguments was really a moral kind of philosophical argument, not an empirical one. There was empirical debate about what impact these new private casinos would have. You would think they'd just take money away, right, from the tribal casinos, but it's more complicated than that because they may create more interest in gaming in the state of Oregon and attract. So the economists really didn't resolve that question, but he made this moral argument. The native people of the Pacific Northwest have not gotten a fair shake from the US government, the state government. Tribal casinos are kind of miraculously one of the few kind of legal structures that have benefited native people in the region. Are you sure you want to mess with that? Are you sure you want to risk taking this one thing away that has been an economic success for so many people of Native ancestry in the state of Oregon? Now, that's not an empirical argument, right? That's not. And so that's kind of beyond what we think a jury is supposed to do, but it's absolutely fair game for the CIR, and it showed up in the statement. In the end, the panelists thought that's actually not a bad argument, right? That's definitely going to be something we want voters to think about. We're not going to tell them how to vote, but you should be thinking about that when you decide on this issue.
That's interesting what you raise, because when you talk about that aspect of the CIR, I'm thinking these are just regular people. These aren't professionals. They're not lawmakers. They're not politicians. Um, is that a good thing? I mean, like, do you want people who don't know the first thing about the issue to make decisions and recommendations about it? What happens, and this maybe ties into, I understand that this is part of a whole movement or philosophy that's called deliberative democracy. Um, what is the utility? What are the drawbacks and the benefits of having just regular people get together and discuss and talk about an issue that is not in their domain of expertise?
Well, you use the term deliberative democracy. Let's also juxtapose that with the term direct democracy. So in the United States, as in many other parts of the world, most prominently Switzerland, there's a clear majority that favor the idea of everyday people getting to vote on legislation, right? And that's why it exists in so many states across the United States. Now, there's critics of direct democracy who argue that's not a good way to make a law, and they have stood their ground in those states that don't have it. There haven't been a lot of states that have changed their laws in this regard. But for those that do have direct democracy, whether or not you think it's a good idea, it's not going anywhere. This is not a power that people will give up, and it's incredibly popular. Oregon is not uncommon in that when we've run surveys on this question, you can get a very large majority to say, yeah, no, I think direct democracy is great. I love the initiative. And I often don't have reliable information on the issues I'm supposed to vote on. And I do think it needs reform, right? The corporate interests have all this concentrated money. They can buy their way onto the ballot and then pay for huge, expensive campaigns, right? That really bothers me. So I love the process and couldn't live without it. And I'm very worried about it, right? So here's where deliberative democracy helps direct democracy. It doesn't take any of that power away from the public. It doesn't question the basic logic of it. Again, I'm not sure you should adopt direct democracy if you don't have it, but once you have it, you might as well make it more deliberative. And when you talk to legislators about this idea, there's a couple things they understand. One is they get frustrated when a law passes, say a ballot measure or initiative, that really constrains their ability to do what they think is in the public's best interest. It may constrain their ability to raise revenue in a certain way. It may require them to spend revenue in a certain way. But the problem with each of those votes that the public makes is they're just one at a time. They don't have to see the big picture, and the legislature has to make a whole budget. So they get frustrated by it. So they think it needs to be improved, even though they won't say anything critical of it because the people love it. But what they also recognize in the CIR is, well, you know what? They think they make good decisions as legislators, but not because they just, a law is put in front of them, they read a 10-word title and vote. They don't do that, right? They have committees, they have hearings, they have legislative research services, right? All these caucus meetings. They understand that you need to have a deliberative infrastructure if you're going to make good decisions. Well, the public doesn't have that, and they see the CIR and say, oh, well, that's kind of like that, and it has a couple big advantages. One, voters don't necessarily trust a lot of information sources. They're very skeptical of public officials and of advertising. The CIR does get a good measure of trust in our surveys. People don't trust it blindly, but they get the fact that, yeah, this is written by my fellow citizens. The jury system itself, the criminal jury system, has a high level of public confidence. The civil jury, a little less so, because the Republican Party in the United States has been so savage to the idea of a civil jury and the awards that they've given, for instance, when they've given punitive awards against corporations. But it's still popular, even though they've cut into its legitimacy a little. But the idea of fellow citizens making these judgments is very democratic. And so in other words, what comes out of that body has a measure of trust with it that wouldn't be there for, say, a blue ribbon commission that analyzed Measure 85. People would just be like, I don't know who those people are. I don't know what their hidden interests are, but they understand that everyday people are just everyday people, right? But the second thing that makes the CIR work in this regard is it's not just 20 or 24 people sitting around talking about a ballot measure, right? Reading the thing over and over. The reading level, and this is a quantitative thing of a typical ballot measure, is about a year of law school. You hear that things are written right at a third grade level. Well, actually, campaign advertisements that appear in print, at least in the state of Oregon when we studied it, are about a junior high level, right? Not quite high school reading level. But the law itself, again, requires 5 years of education post high school. So you need to meet voters somewhere in between, and that's where the CIR comes in. But imagine them just trying to read the law by themselves and speculate. I mean, what is the economic impact of this proposal? Well, that's why you have witnesses. That's why you have the pro and con sides bring in who they consider authoritative experts, and they can cite, hopefully, some evidence for their claims, and you bring in some neutral experts. Healthy Democracy usually picks those, but in consultation with both the pro and con sides. In fact, in the early CIR, the panelists themselves got to choose who they needed to hear from this pool of neutral experts, which is a neat process, but more labor intensive, a little bit more expensive. You get the bottom line here is you're hearing from fellow citizens so they have credibility through a deliberative process that has tons of information and analysis baked right into it. So it's not just a couple dozen people BSing, right, sitting at a conference hotel trying to figure this thing out. They have a lot of help, but in the end, they and only they decide what goes onto that page.
You were talking about trust, John, and it sounds to me like, why wouldn't people just vote on whatever measure it is across party lines? I mean, we know that United States has become very, very partisan recently. It sounds to me like you raised an example of something about minimum mandatory sentences. It doesn't. What happens is just you get left-leaning people, or you get progressives, and you get conservatives, and they split across party lines and vote according to their political beliefs.
Well, let me give you another example. The second CIR that was ever held after the mandatory minimum one, where, as you saw, people from the left and the right all converged in opposition to the proposed law. The second one was on medical marijuana, and the deliberation was good. The statement that the CIR produced was quite sensible, had a lot of good insight, really helped you understand the law. But when we as researchers broke down the CIR panel itself based on their cultural orientation, something we measured through surveys. And fortunately, CIR panelists have been incredibly generous with us as researchers. Our response rate, I was actually just citing this in an article today, is literally 99%. I mean, in a sense, we're cheating, right? Because the people who show up at these things are already, to some degree, volunteering and compliant, right? So when we give them a survey at the end of each day, not surprisingly, they almost always fill it out. I had the same good luck with jurors, by the way, who most people don't show up for jury services. A little known fact, but very true. So those who do show up are also more likely to take my surveys. But the medical marijuana issue in the end was almost an even split. I think the vote was like 13 to 11, and it split roughly along these cultural ideological lines. Not literally partisan lines, right? It wasn't Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other. But people are more complex than just left, right, liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican. We mapped them on a kind of two-dimensional cultural grid that gives you a little bit better sense of how people identify themselves. And that was a very good prediction of how those 24 panelists fell out on that issue. So in the end, the empirical aspects of the issue were interesting and kind of balanced, but it came down to kind of a sense of what kind of society you want. It was sort of a moral judgment for many of the panelists, which is why their ideology in this case was able to predict where they ended up on the issue. Now, there was still an impact on the electorate from that statement, according to our survey experiments that we ran. So some people were swayed by reading the statement. But again, there's nothing wrong with the CIR statement basically laying out an issue for you and saying, you know, it really comes down to a values question. If these are your most prominent values, you prioritize these values over these other ones, well, then you're probably going to vote for this, and vice versa, you'll vote against it. But as you saw with mandatory minimums, sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes there are less obvious values that come to the fore. In that case, things like opportunity cost. This was an incredibly expensive piece of legislation that it wasn't clear was going to have much positive impact, right? So you were going to spend a lot. Well, it turns out conservatives, as much as they want to be tough on crime, they also hate it when the government wastes money, right? But you don't think of, that's not the first thing you think of when you hear mandatory minimum sentencing. Well, again, the CIR is helping you, in this case, not just giving you some basic facts, but also making you think about the other values that are in play that aren't so obvious.
You're a researcher, right? And what is this thing that people seem to split so much across, I don't know what you call it, political lines, cultural lines? Like some people are, you know, hierarchical, egalitarian, progressive, conservative, left, right, whatever you want to call it. And it seems like more and more these days, especially, like people are looking at reality and seeing totally different things. Can you explain a little bit about that, about why people split that way?
Yeah, and let's talk about it. And you're right, there's lots of different terms, and I'm using some different terms. I'm partly drawing on something called a cultural cognitive theory. Dan Kahan at Yale University sort of heads up that project, and super interesting if you want to read more about that. But we can distinguish a few different ways in which people are divided. So I think the most concerning thing right now is, as you say, uh, everybody has their own facts, right? This is not a new phenomena, right? People have understood the world in very different ways empirically due to their biases. It's baked right into the way our brain works. But we are seeing a level of division in our understanding of the empirical world now that is in some ways unprecedented and is absolutely a reflection of the changing information and communication environment, social media and so on, helping us separate our sources of information such that people can select their facts, right? Little footnote on that, though. Ben Barber is a political scientist who passed away a few years ago, and one of his arguments was that the reason why we do better with mayoral elections, you know, electing a mayor as opposed to governor or the president, is the mayor is in the business of delivering things that you can see with your naked eye. If the snow is not being shoveled, you know the snow is not being shoveled. The mayor can get up there and say, snow removal is my highest priority. I am the snow removal mayor. And if you can't get out of your driveway and onto the interstate, you know that's a lie, right? All the ideology in the world won't help that mayor. And that's, he argues, why mayors are often truly nonpartisan, right? They may have some ideological objectives and some values that they hold dear, but they also need to make sure the snow gets removed. I think we're seeing a little bit of that right now, even in the era of, you know, a separation of facts and so on in the presidential election. The coronavirus has a way of as you've seen the T-shirts and mugs and so on, science doesn't care what you think, right? You can have your opinion, but it won't help you if you are infected, right? And that's just something the president can't spin, right? So again, people are so rooted ideologically, there's all kinds of reasons they're voting for or against Trump. But I think that hurts him with this, little middle of the electorate that might swing one way or the other. This is like the snow not being removed. He can say all he wants about how he's handled the coronavirus, but a lot of people have already decided the snow was not removed. You did not do your job, right? And I can see that plainly. And I think that has hurt him in a way that most issues can't. I mean, pre-existing conditions in healthcare is, a debate that could have implications if, in fact, Obamacare is repealed, but it hasn't been. And so, you can claim that, of course, I wouldn't do, you get the point, that you get into all these details and people don't know whether the snow is going to be removed under your administration or not. So that's, to me, the most worrying thing is the selective facts. And again, we need a better information infrastructure to address that problem. And we're just going to have to think about what kind of world we want to live in and what role social media plays and so on. But there's a couple other ways in which we're divided, one of which concerns me a great deal, and one which doesn't honestly concern me too much at all. The second one of these three is affective polarization. You can think of it as emotional distance, but it's actually worse than that. It's if you're a liberal and I'm a conservative, how do we feel about each other? Right? And affective polarization has been getting worse and worse. And there's no logical reason that has to happen. We understand why it happens, right? Tribalism and so on sets in, and there are real things to be upset about that the other side is doing, but that when that morphs into hatred, it's incredibly dangerous. And that's how we get things like a plot to kidnap and possibly kill, if necessary, the governor of the state of Michigan. That's dangerous stuff. And the more that fringe kind of behavior drifts into the mainstream, the more worrisome that becomes. The fact that a candidate can stand for office who openly believes in the QAnon theory isn't just a question of someone being way off on the facts. It also suggests they have a deep hatred for the opposition. In the case of the QAnon theory, if you're not familiar with it, that means that they believe that the government, mostly liberals and these deep state bureaucrats, are literally running a child sex trafficking ring on a massive global scale. Okay, you clearly have more than your own set of facts. You clearly think these people are monsters. Finally, there's a division between the left and the right that I think is fine. And if anything, the crystallization of it helps us, which is a clarification of your values and your values priorities. There's research that shows globally polarization goes up as education goes up. That is, the more you get a good education on issues and philosophy and so on, the more you clarify what you value. And people do genuinely disagree about values. Is liberty more important to you than equality, or vice versa? These are age-old questions, right? And it's not that if, I'm a lefty liberal, I privilege equality. It's not that I don't respect liberty. I love freedom and personal freedom. But when they're in conflict, in some cases, I'll come down on the side of equality, whereas a conservative friend of mine who values equality will come down on the side of liberty, right? And it's those tough calls that are so interesting. And the more you can clarify your values, the more you can state and articulate a clear position, and we can have a really substantive debate. So not all kinds of division between these different groups are bad. But some of them are terrible, and we are suffering as a result.
It's interesting. You clearly made your own political biases clear to any of the viewers, and that's fine. But here's the thing. So the counterpoint to what you were saying is people can clearly see that people are dying from corona. People can also clearly see that their kids are home from school for half a year and they're becoming depressed. They clearly see that their neighbors are husband is beating each other wife. It's not a zero-sum game. And you see that again and again in many, many things. And in this era of fake news and there's always interpretations to science, right? If you talk about something like climate change, you can see if the temperature has gone up etc. But then you get into questions of what is the most effective solution. So if you talk about fossil fuels versus electrical, then there's a lot of uh, environmental overhead to making a battery. And a lot of times when the conversations are being had, they're not being held in a spirit of open exploration. They're being held more in a spirit of teams. We're one team and you're the other team, and I'm going to beat you, and I'm going to do whatever I can in order to make sure my point of view wins. So, if it's okay, I'd like to ask you to give a personal example, if such exists, of you following a process in the CIR and your own perspective changing about the issue as a result of the debate, from what your default should have been
Sure.
to you've seen the process unfold and you're like, okay, that makes sense.
I can actually give you a bunch of examples because this is very reflective of me. Let me just add a couple nuances to things you just said. Uh, whether so our metaphor here is that the mayor is held accountable for snow removal, right? In my example, it sounds like if snow is not removed, it's the mayor's fault. Unfortunately, there is an irrationality to this too, which is that there's something called retrospective voting, which sounds good, like voters hold officials accountable. That is, they think back retrospectively. It's sort of the old question, Reagan posed, right? Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Well, if you're better off, then you should be rewarding the administration, right? And that's one of the remarkable things about the recent poll result that showed that a majority of Americans do feel they're better off now economically than they were. They're just not voting for Trump. Which again is a little bit unprecedented and tells you that there's more to it than just this retrospection. But it may be that the mayor couldn't remove the snow for reasons that were beyond the mayor's control. They'll still be held accountable for it, right? So going to the issue of coronavirus, what I'm saying is it doesn't matter which of the bads of the coronavirus we're talking about. And sadly, it doesn't necessarily matter so much how much the government is responsible for those. I realize Trump is held accountable for things that he couldn't have controlled, right? There was going to be a death toll, and we can debate the models about how large it would have been under different circumstances, but he will be held accountable. The snow was not removed, right? So for all, and it's not helping him that in some ways his rhetoric has been saying, you know what, this wasn't such a big deal, right? Initially I
John,
told you it would go
John,
away.
I'm sorry to cut into you. I'm
Sure,
gonna try to do it as little as possible, but I would like to shift the conversation from Trump per se to the issue of the CIR.
sure.
Can you give an example of where you started off on an issue with a very, very clear opinion about it, where you feel, as obviously left leaning, that
Sure.
this is the right thing, but as you heard the conversation and the process unfolding, you change your position?
Right. So I can think of a few examples, and they actually predate the CIR. One of the things that also influenced the CIR is something called the National Issues Forums, held by the Kettering Foundation. They give you discussion guides that break down an issue into different policy choices. In this case, it's not just yes or no on a piece of legislation, but it's kind of a variety of perspectives. And that was the first time I really remember changing my mind. It was on the internet and the regulation of the internet. And simply put, uh, I became much more concerned about government censorship. Um, Being a lefty liberal, and like you said, I made it clear what my bias is. I think it's easier when people say where their kind of political and ideological position is and don't dance around it. I was inclined to believe that we do need to protect the community in some ways with regard to speech and hate speech and so on. And from reading that issue guide, I came to a couple conclusions. One is I think we should be much more skeptical of attempts to control speech that come from the government. But the other one that I hadn't really thought about, so it's not so much it changed my position as it added a nuance that again contradicts probably where I stood beforehand, which is, and you know what, in private industry, you really don't have much say at all. That's not, that if a company wants to run itself a certain way and have its own internal speech codes, that's more or less fine. When companies become of a certain size that they're so large that they're kind of creating a public space as Facebook is, regulation might be more appropriate. But it really kind of pushed back on my kind of regulatory impulses. Now, with the CIR itself, I can think of one particular issue I observed in 2016. There was a ballot measure sponsored by a group called Our Oregon, which proposed raising a ton of revenue that would go to the stuff that's near and dear to me, various social services and so on. Um, you can't guarantee how the legislature would spend the money, but that's how the bulk of the money raised by the state of Oregon is spent, on things such as healthcare and education. And so, I was very much inclined to say, yeah, this is great. States need more revenue. Um, and by the end, I was convinced that the law was badly designed, that the spirit of it was good, but it was probably an overreach. It was too big of a shock to the Oregon economy in terms of how much revenue would be raised, much of that expense obviously being passed on to consumers, which in a way creates kind of a regressive tax, right? In some ways, the people in Oregon who can least afford it would be contributing the most to something that would benefit them, sure, but I would actually rather see a progressive tax do the same thing. And so I didn't think they necessarily had the right tax. I didn't feel that they were being completely honest about what the implications of that tax would be. So as much as I wanted the extra spending for the sake of Oregon, right, I'm a Pennsylvania resident at this point, um, I had to admit that, yeah, I didn't think that was a good law. So yeah, those are examples from both my own personal experience in a forum and then as an observer watching a CIR, feeling myself shift. And there's lots of other shifts too that are more subtle, that aren't so much changing ideological position, so much as changing perspective. One of my favorite stories on this was, again, a national issues forum on abortion. And you'd think, well, no one's going to change their mind on that issue, right? And they had pro-choice and pro-life representatives kind of talking at this big forum. This was held in Texas. I didn't see it firsthand, but I heard the account of it. Um, and one of the points of the organizer was, okay, we're going to articulate our different values and our different points of view, but we also want to potentially discover common ground. So where do pro-choice and pro-life find common purpose? And you can tell me whether you'd ever thought of this. Uh, they discovered that miscarriage and the danger of miscarriage is something they really could agree on. That from the pro-life side, it's still a loss of life, even if you don't see an intention to end the life of the fetus. It's what happens. From the pro-choice side is women who experience this had chosen to have a child. It was something they wanted. And miscarriage is spread across the population, but it disproportionately affects relatively marginalized populations who have less access to quality health care and so on. So for them, it was kind of equal access to childbirth. And for the pro-life side, it was another way of protecting life. And they could agree that though they'll continue to disagree about Roe v. Wade and whether and when abortion should be legal, they could devote some energy to addressing that issue. Now, had that ever crossed your mind in the debate about pro-choice and pro-life?
Well, that specific question did not come up, but we did have a roundtable conversation about pro-choice versus pro-life. I will post the link below, or maybe here to the side. Um, it is interesting, like the things you said brings up the following question. People seem to split more or less personality-wise towards left-leaning and right-leaning. Um, how do you feel that these natural human inclinations complement each other? Because you gave an example of, you said I had a position that was very, very clear about hate speech and I felt it should be limited, but I saw the process unfolding where we were reviewing it and it changed my mind. I felt this was going to be dangerous towards freedom of speech per se, like it wasn't very well crafted at all, even if the intentions were good. So can you speak a little bit as a researcher about how you feel that we complement each other, how you feel that the whole is larger than the sum of its parts, as far as people who are more conservative leaning and people who are more progressive leaning? How do we balance each other out and make a bigger, stronger nation as a result?
Sure. So first, let me put a little red circle around the word personality, which you used. People are very fond of talking about the fundamental brain chemistry, brain structure differences between liberals and conservatives. And I, I've read a fair bit of that, and I'm deeply skeptical of the size of that difference. To say that people differ isn't necessarily to say much. And in this case, for instance, those who identify as politically more conservative, it's absolutely true, have less tolerance for ambiguity, and have a narrower set of values that they have to reconcile than those who identify as liberal, who have to deal with more complexity in the range of values they're trying to weigh and so on. Um, it is absolutely true that people on the left have some egalitarian impulses, and that authoritarian impulses correlate with a more conservative political ideology. But I know people on the left who are absolutely authoritarian. They wouldn't call it that. They might not express that politically. They may seem to want an egalitarian social agenda. But remember, we were talking about personality, and the way they behave socially strikes me as dangerously autocratic. And again, that's on both sides of the political spectrum, and it expresses itself in political moments sometimes when you have left-wing or right-wing populists who are really, frankly, autocratic in either case. So again, I don't want us to overstate the personality difference. So the deeper question is what can we learn from each other in terms of more sophisticated ideological kind of programs, right? And here I like to try to redeem think tanks a little bit. Think tanks have a role to play in society, which is they take some values commitments and they look at the evidence if they do their job well, and most don't. And then they say, you know, if these are your values, this is how you should look at this policy issue. And they sometimes come up with insights that balance conservative and liberal concerns. And those think tanks, I think, can produce really useful ideas. Now, a classic example of this, and I know you've probably heard this before, is actually Obamacare, which in the end came from a conservative think tank. It really did. That's why Mitt Romney adopted it in Massachusetts. Now, obviously, there's iterations and so on, but it's a weird kind of Frankenstein combination of universal health care and private insurance, right? And that was concocted by a kind of a meeting of this egalitarian impulse on the left and a skepticism about the concentration of power in government on the right. The more deeper philosophical difference that I would point to comes from the work of Thomas Sowell, is conservatives are deeply skeptical about human nature itself. That's why governments are corrupt, because they're occupied by human beings. And we want to live in a society that tries to sort of keep people at a distance from each other because people are just awful, right? They just can't be. And you need religion, you need strong religious institutions to try to keep people in check. But goodness, be careful about the concentration of power. Whereas on the left, we're optimists. And, I always want to design a new institution. Let's try a new policy and a new infrastructure we can layer on top of the old infrastructure and just keep building because, we're utopian and optimistic. Well, obviously, both of those impulses can go horribly wrong, right? You can put too much faith in human nature, or you can put too little in it. And the truth lies somewhere in between. Now, if we have evidence-based public policy, sometimes these questions get reduced to empirical questions. Does my proposal for the war on poverty actually reduce poverty is an empirical question. My ideological commitment might lead me to a particular policy solution, but we should be able to agree on how to collect data to evaluate the quality of that policy. The CIR is no different in the sense that my research for 10 years wasn't, I'm doing a research project to show that the CIR is great. But the point of the research was to see whether it worked, right? Do the citizen panels themselves deliberate effectively? Do they write statements that are free of factual errors and are useful to voters? And then in turn, does it have an impact on voters? Does it actually make people more knowledgeable? Does it make them feel more engaged with the issue, more willing to even vote on it? And the evidence there is pretty good. A phrase I stumbled on the other day was, I think I'm a glass third full kind of guy. The glass isn't quite half full, but you know what? A third full is better than empty, right? And someone else might say, well, the CIR doesn't solve all our problems. Throw it away. And I'm like, well, I think you had an unrealistic expectation for what a single election reform can do. A glass third full is pretty sweet. So you get my point that we can have different value commitments. They can lead us to different policy proposals, but hopefully they don't interfere with our ability to judge the efficacy of those proposals in the end.
Um, I do think it's fascinating what you said about the inclination of the left its also capability to be very authoritarian, like the extreme right. There seems to be a strong fixation in today's culture about the extreme right. Personally, I can share I am Jewish and I have family that escaped Soviet Russia. So I feel a very healthy fear of both the extremes on the right and extremes on the left. I mean, Nazis murdered a bit south of 21 million people, not including combatants. Communism murdered a bit north of 150 million worldwide. So that's a lot of dead bodies, and I have a very strong family memory that's very, very emotional of just how horrible that extremism on the left goes. And I think a lot of the increasing polarization and fear that we see today in our society is people kind of fearing the extremes on the other side. And I think there's a lot of merit to giving that thought. And that brings me to my next question, which is I feel like it is very, very important to have and give a platform for a balanced conversation and cooperation between left leaning and right leaning people. Kind of like if you take a Star Wars analogy, we need to have the light side of the force and the dark side of the force in balance. You don't want the force to go out of balance. I see that you don't like my analogy, but
It's a terrible analogy if you understand the Star Wars universe. It's horrible. The dark side of the force is the embodiment of evil. But that aside, I get your point.
Maybe I should sharpen up my knowledge of Star Wars
One built
world.
a Death Star, which was a planet-killing weapon, and the other side is the resistance. The analogy actually works better than you might have intended, but no.
Depending on who you play on any side. Okay, we'll scrap that analogy, but we will talk about the principle that we want to have a balance of forces and a way to balance out people's natural inclinations. So, what you do also want, and you don't want to have, is you want to be able to block out the extremes both on the right on the left, and that means that you do have to agree on a certain core set of values that we can both agree on in the right and the left. I feel that in the West, like the basic idea of the West is the value of the individual, that every human being has inherent value. I'd be happy to hear what you feel about it. What do you feel is like the meta consensus that you want to have amongst people, well, engage in civic society and in democracy and or in the CIR itself for it to work?
Meta consensus is absolutely the right way to say it. That is, there's a higher order agreement, even if we disagree down in the details. And there are two things. One, I want us to agree on the broad principles of the scientific method, the way we collect systematic empirical evidence. It is impossible to evaluate public policy if we can't agree on those basic principles. That doesn't mean there won't be disagreement among the experts, say, who study the economy or the environment or what have you. But the United States right now is an outlier on some scientific questions because there's a broad rejection of scientific evidence, which is part of our anti-intellectual tradition. I mean, this is a country of skeptics, right? We're like Australia in that way. Australia is on survey measures the only more individualistic country in the world than the United States. As my Australian friends like to say, they're more American than Americans. But there's another meta consensus. So aside from that, how we accumulate knowledge, kind of an epistemological agreement. There is a meta consensus on values that might surprise you, which again, I'll take the example of equality and liberty. We agree that those are both paramount values, that they're crucial, right? We have to be concerned about those things. It's a question of balance. It's a question of priority, but it goes a long way toward building kind of a bridge across the ideological divide. When conservatives can say, look, I care deeply about equality. I'll give you an example. Equality of opportunity resonates with me, right? I think every kid should have a shot. And if there are kids growing up in America who don't have a chance to get a basic education, that's wrong. That goes against my sense of equality. And then to hear a liberal say something like, well, I do think people should be able to make their own individual judgments, right? I understand personal liberty. Take the coronavirus, right? I get it that even if masks are, scientifically shown to be helpful, there are a lot of situations where we have to let individuals exercise their judgment. And so in some cases, I might want rules, but in other cases, I get your point. A guideline should be enough. And let's hope that we can help people make good judgments, but we'll leave it to their individual discretion. Right. So, again, there should be a give and take there because we recognize we share the same values, but we prioritize them differently. It's like when a candidate says, I support future generations. I believe in children. It's like, who are they running against? Right? You know, oh, I hate children. I think they're terrible. We should focus on the here and now and to heck with them. I mean, they can take care of themselves once they're 18. Right? Nobody says that. So it's a ludicrous, and that's why it's so funny when you hear it and you hear it for what it is. It's like you're not arguing with anyone. But it's something else to say, you know what? I actually think the needs of future generations should take precedence over our own needs. And I know that's hard to hear, but I think we actually have to make some sacrifices that are going to hurt us because the downstream consequences of doing the opposite would hurt our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren so much more. Now, that's politically courageous, right? That's saying something because you're talking about a values trade-off. So, yeah, we can agree on the broad values, we can agree on some epistemological points, hopefully, and then get into some good disagreements about the evidence and about our values and how to prioritize them. That's where I think the debate is fruitful, and that's what deliberation is all about.
I think it's also important to appreciate just how much of a non-obvious thing that is, because if you look at human history or even the world today or in very recent history, that is not necessarily a given that people agree about these things. You know, like I said, my family is from Soviet Russia. Like my grandfather was this close to being sent to the front to die without a gun, probably going to be murdered by the NKVD, by the secret police, shooting him in the back because whatever. And that's very real. Formative he spent his formative years of teenage years in Siberia on a budget of 600 to 800 calories a day. I read on health.gov that somebody his age, physically active, and he was quite physically active in order to survive. He was working in a factory, needs 2,600 to 3,000 calories a day, if I remember correctly. So, somewhat short, and it's an interesting experience. You could take even more extreme examples of both hunger and other things that are. But the idea was, you don't matter as an individual. What matters is the party and the success of the party, and that's it. Like you are literally like not like the individual human has zero value. And I feel that the fact that we do feel that people, humans, have a value, whatever their color, creed, or sex, it's not such an obvious thing that we should rush past it without actually acknowledging and taking acknowledging the fact that we're on the same page on this thing. And it's not nonsense. I have a neighbor who's escaped Russia today because he was afraid of being thrown into prison and having everything he ever had being taken away from him for no good reason. He said something against Putin. And today you see in China that the Uyghurs are there's a genocide being committed against them because they're Muslims. They're physically being forced to um, uh, not be able to make children anymore. And it's horrible, horrible things that people don't really take the time to appreciate of how much we're more similar to each other than we are different, I think. And I think that's important to remember. And it does bring me to my next question that I wanted to ask you. I feel like over the last couple of years in the United States, there's been a gradual process of kind of skepticism towards both political participation and towards, more importantly, each other. I feel like there's been an increasing divide between the left and the right where they less and less see what is common and more what is different. And I feel like if you go into such a process, you said it's 5 days of the CIR with people who are different from you politically, you might go through a process of like seeing not only their humanity again, but how much more we are similar than we are different. And I think like every single issue that you brought, if it's pro-life, pro-choice, or gun control, whatever it is, people agree on the broad more. They agree more than they differentiate. It's the devil's in the details, like you said in the beginning of the interview. Can you speak about how you feel like a process like this might help us to come closer again, united again as a nation, as a people, as humans?
Well, the evidence is crystal clear that participating in a deliberative event like the CIR, and there's a lot of different things, citizens' assemblies and deliberative polls and so on, they always have that effect. Not on everyone, but in the aggregate, for the people who participate, it's dramatic. It's really dramatic. It's inspiring to them civically and so on. In fact, the previous 10 years of my research that led to the book The Jury and the Democracy was about the fact that serving on a jury makes you a more engaged citizen. The experience of deliberating increases your long-term voting rate by about 5%. It seems like I'm the 5% guy. Um, and that's kind of amazing, right? And why wouldn't it be so, right? The experience of deliberating with your fellow citizens, the point of democracy, right? Self-government, experiencing that in a more tangible way is powerful. Um, and even Tocqueville, centuries ago, basically, on a French college student on a road trip kind of thing. It's like even he could see it, right? Hey, this is amazing. This is going to be great. Well, there aren't many opportunities to do that, right? In fact, we use juries less in terms of a percentage of cases than we used to by quite a bit. And the CIR is a rare experience, right? So maybe you get to experience something in the classroom, a mock jury or something. It's just not the same because it is just an exercise. So to scale up that experience of deliberating with your fellow citizens and seeing what they're capable of and what you're capable of, and how information and values can fit together to give you a real sophisticated look on something, we need to find a way to scale that up. And that's why the research that I'm focused on now is all about transforming the experience of being online when it comes to civic engagement and when it comes to public consultation, that is the relationship between your government and the public. So I want to learn lessons from things like mobile gaming that give us incentives to do things that we might not otherwise do. I'll just give you one tangible example. If you Google super forecasting, you'll see some fantastic research on how with the right incentives, the most ideological think tanks and so on, they can figure out the issue. You can take groups that, for instance, have divergent views on the Middle East and give them a large enough incentive, real money that would go to their foundation, and lo and behold, they're very capable of forecasting quite accurately what will happen in the Middle East under various circumstances. Ideologically, they want to say something else, but they want the money, right? So it's not that they're stupid and they've deluded themselves. It's that they have no incentive to be correct, right? So when we're online, we have the same problem. It's in your Facebook feed. It's in who you hang out with. Um, and so I'm very interested in research that helps us think about the way of marshaling these incentives, changing people's perspectives, and ultimately getting better results from people's input to the government, from the government's response to the people, and for how we organize as citizens in a free society. Incentives matter, and in the online world, we should be able to structure those in ways that help us govern ourselves.
You more about how much incentives matters. I think that's actually a fundamental aspect of the very strong power that capitalism has to improve the lives of people. And like if you look at the data, you see that extreme poverty has been getting reduced in an ever increasing rate in the past, really like a couple of decades at an unprecedented rate. And I think there is it is important to acknowledge how helpful it has been in doing that. Um, I do want to try starting and wrapping up. I did want to ask you. Obviously, the CR is a very specific type of initiative, and I wanted to ask you what else is there, because it seems to me like the biggest um, value from it is the fact that it lets us talk to each other and figure out between ourselves what is actually best for all of us, and people can bring in their diversity in the way they see the world and create a solution, like you said, that is not necessarily according to their blind ideological blinders, but more according to what is actually going to be best for all of us. Can you share with us, as a researcher, any other initiatives, any other projects that exist today that bode well? for for a future as a nation and a society?
Sure. I'll give you two of the most prominent examples in the field. One comes from Ireland. There's a couple processes there. They had a constitutional convention and a citizens' assembly. The first of which was two-thirds randomly selected citizens of Ireland and one-third sitting legislators, which was an interesting combination. And they came up with a raft of proposals, many of which got implemented, some of which got put on the ballot. A citizens' assembly followed, which was just randomly selected citizens, and they've had tremendous success with that. They won the Brown Democracy Medal from Penn State, and as a result, published a short book. That's the catch for getting the prize and the cash that comes with it. Talk about incentives. You have to publish a very publicly accessible book about your experience. And so that and many other writings are available online. You can read about it, but it's one of the reasons that some very significant laws have changed in Ireland. The other example that gets cited a lot is the deliberative poll. And what's fun about that is you can go to Stanford University's center that conducts the deliberative poll and oversees it and just see such a variety of examples from what I think is still to date the most dramatic public opinion shift, which was the Texas Public Utilities deliberating on what should be the future in terms of energy goals for Texas, shifting dramatically towards renewables. It was such a staggering result that they actually conducted it a second time with different people and got the same result. That, Texans love being big and they love money, and that's where the big money is. But then other examples in China, South Korea, nuclear power, all kinds of interesting issues. Mongolia has now actually built the deliberative poll into their constitutional amendment system. So you can trigger kind of a public deliberation on the issue by this randomly selected body. But there's just a ton of fun examples from around the world using the deliberative poll, and they're pretty inspiring to people. So again, many examples of many different processes. The CIR is just one of them. But I'll underscore something about the CIR that made it special and worth studying for a decade, which is it's not just that it's an example of people deliberating and having a great time. We knew that already. It almost always works when it's well structured. The problem with so many of its forerunners was once the deliberation is over, it doesn't matter. Nobody has to listen to it. And for the most part, people don't even know that it happened. What makes the CIR special is that statement that the citizens write goes into the voter guide that the state then mails to every registered voter. Effectively, the CIR has its own media system built into it, right? Its own way of conveying these thoughts and reflections to the larger public. And that's why it's special. And that's why I think it's such an encouraging election reform, because it has a mechanism for making the deliberation matter on a large scale. And then the evidence is that, again, the glass is a third full. It does matter. It makes people more accurate in their empirical beliefs and more reflective in their judgments. That's pretty encouraging.
I agree with you quite a bit. It is very encouraging, and I felt reading your book, I felt that it was very, very encouraging. I think in general, this is, although a challenging time, there's also a lot of things that are encouraging. Like, I would like to see a future where we use the online space rather in order to create our own little echo chambers to create a platform where we can all actually be exposed to people of different perspectives and actually challenge our own ways of viewing things and be enriched by each other's diversity. I think that would be a good thing. And I would like to thank you for the interview. It was very, very illuminating, very interesting. You are a very pleasant speaker. I would like if you could tell our audience where they, if you have a blog or about your book, where they could find it, what's it about. If you could introduce, there you go.
Yeah, Hope for Democracy. It's actually my first audiobook. Victor Bevine, the voice of the Mueller Report at Audible. He does all kinds of projects for Audible, and that was one thing they asked him to do. He read it literally flawlessly. My co-author and I listened to the whole thing and didn't have a single edit, which is kind of remarkable. And it's fun to hear it in his voice. He sounds so smart compared to how we think we hear ourselves. But it really is available in every format. And just a note about it is I've written lots of academic books. But this is the first time I really sincerely tried to write a piece of narrative nonfiction. And Katie and I worked with a professional editor to tell stories, right? And so it's really the story of the people who created the CIR. And it even ties all the way back to the American Revolution and ancient Greece. I mean, all these things are woven together in a way that's really fun. There's no footnotes, no citations littering the pages. There are essays at the back about the sources underlying all of our empirical claims, which are also kind of playful and fun and written in a narrative style. So that was a real deviation from even how these kinds of sort of crossover books get written, uh, that we really wanted it to be accessible. And if you wanted to know more, just go to the back of the book and read those essays. So hopefully people enjoy it. Hopefully it's a little bit inspiring. And the title of the book says the emotion we're intending you to experience, which is maybe just a little bit of hope.
Very, very good, very illuminating read. I would forewarn people who are conservative leaning who read the book, you might be a little bit pushed away by the fact that your bias, as you clearly said it, is kind of comes out from the book, and that's clear. But I feel like it would behoove us to have patience within ourselves to hear somebody out, even if you're not starting from the same point of view, does not mean that you cannot learn from somebody else, that there isn't there something that is of value to all of us as a society. I think, like you said, most of us generally want the same things. We want to have a strong nation, a fair nation, a successful nation where people are free and happy to share and connect with each other and grow. And I think we've been doing a pretty good job in the last almost 250 years. Hopefully, maybe another 250 years, and keep on spreading good in the world. Thank you very much, John Gastil. I appreciate your time, and thank you for our viewers. I appreciate your time. I hope you found this illuminating. Keep on spreading the art of listening. Have a wonderful day.